Hello guys, this is Sevelat. As you may know, I have been working with Magento 2 for some time now, and during my daily work I do Magento 2 coding and also doing some code review for Magento 2. I've seen a lot of Magento 2 modules of different code quality. There were some modules which were worked fine, and there were modules which has a lot of issues, and those issues have like two different nature, let's say. Part of them are because of Magento 2 core bugs, but a lot of issues are related with the bad implementation of the code itself, because some developers not really understand the core concepts of object-oriented design and therefore misuse some Magento services. That's why I decided to prepare some videos in which I will explain the important concepts which are applicable not only in Magento 2 context but in any modern PHP framework. And one of these core concepts is dependency injection. If you Google the dependency injection principle, you will get a lot of definitions and a lot of smart words used about the implementing inversion of control principle, and it might be confusing if you never met with this conception before. In order to understand dependency injection concept better, we need to introduce the concept of different object types. If you decide to investigate the object-oriented design, you will probably meet the domain-driven design approach. Here are some definitions by Eric Evans, who is the original author of Domain-Driven Design book. And he claims that there are different groups of objects we are working in during software development. And the first groups is entities. And the entities are essentially the objects which have identity. It's a like unique property by which you can distinguish one object from another. For example, in Magento 2, we have products which have SKUs, and we have categories and customers which has identifiers. The next group is value object, and value objects are comparable by their value. So basically, two objects considered equal if their values are the same. The canonical example is the money object. So let's say we have two objects of money, and each money object has a value and the currency code. And if we would have two objects with the currency code euro and the value of 10, we would consider those are equal objects. There is no any unique identifier to distinguish those objects. There's also a concept of a service, which is a standalone operation within the context of your domain. To simplify this, service is any action, any operation you would perform on the object. And the service object, it's just an object which collects or groups those methods. In Magento 2, the example of a service would be any repository. It has save, get list methods, which are services. But I will use the term of service, and I will refer the service object instead of single method during this video. This is the theory, and let's try to see how this theory is applied in Magento. Magento 2 developers came with their own definitions, and they propose two groups of objects. And the first one is injectable objects, which are basically the service objects. And if you go through documentation, you will see that they treat service objects as singletons. That means that Object Manager creates the single instance of a service, and this instance is used during the whole request response cycle. The second group is viewable or non-injectable objects. Those objects obtained by creating a new class of instance every time. Why those objects needed to be created every time because they require some input, whether this input from HTTP request or some data from database, which is required to instantiate the object. For example, product or a customer objects are non-injectable because to create the customer object or a product, we need to know in advance which concrete product we want to instantiate. We need to know it SKU or email or ID, some specific and unique property to create the concrete object. Understanding the difference between these two categories is extremely important, not only in Magento 2 context, but in any PHP framework. Here is a list of rules for using Magento Dependency Injection. I'm not going to go through all of them, I just underline the key points. The first one is injectable objects may request other dependencies in their constructors if those objects are also injectable. This means that any service can request other service in the constructor but not newable object. So basically, you shouldn't request models or collections directly in the constructor of your service. After discussing some theory, it's probably a good time to check the source code and see how Magento implements dependency injection. Here we see Object Manager interface, which is the key service responsible for dependency injection and object instantiation. It's a high-level service which provides all the objects required during the request response cycle. Let's check some service definition. Here I have order service, and if we check its constructor, we see that it has number of dependencies. When this object is instantiated, the object manager get method is called. Here we have object manager get method implementation, and we can see it receives the required class name as an argument, and it delegates the instantiation process to the abstract factory. I'd like to draw your attention to this line. This is very important part. As you can see, after object is instantiated, the object manager puts the instance of this object to its internal cache. And when the next time this object is requested by application, the object manager checks the internal cache, and if the object have been already created, the object manager will return the very same instance. That basically means that the first object of any class created during the request response cycle will be used across the application. Now let's check how factory creates those objects. Here we have factory interface, and this interface has multiple implementations. The specific implementation used depending on the application mode. For example, let's go and check the factory used in developer mode. Let's try to understand what's going on here. First of all, factory need to analyze the class definition to see if this object has dependencies or not. If the requested object does not have any dependencies, the factory just use the new keyword and the class name to instantiate the object and returns it right away. The process becomes more complicated when the requested object does have dependencies. In this case, factory need to analyze the circular dependency to avoid the situation when two classes require each other in their constructors. After that, the factory could proceed with the instantiation process. At this point, we have only list of class names required as the dependencies for the original class. And therefore, a factory need to resolve each of these arguments and get the dependency object, which will be injected in the original object constructor. Let's check how factory resolves dependencies. Now we can see the factory iterates through the list of parameters and calls a resolve argument method for each of these dependencies. And here's the part when the thing get interesting. Because if we check the resolve argument implementation, we will see that the factory uses the object manager, and the factory chooses between get and create methods depending on the shared attribute or shared flag we configured in our DI XML. Note that all services defined in the DI XML are shared by default. We also can understand that this is a recursive operation because the object manager uses factory to instantiate the object, and the factory uses object manager to resolve the dependencies of the original object. And this recursive chain of calls continues until all the dependencies of the original class will be resolved and all the dependencies will be instantiated, and after that the factory will be able to create the original object. So guys, that was a brief overview of the object instantiation process in Magento 2, and we see how object manager and the abstract factories are connected with each other. I really encourage you to investigate the source code to check the object manager implementation, go through all the abstract factories to see how they really create the objects, and hopefully this dependency injection process will become less magical for you. If you want, you can go and dig a bit deeper to see how the reflection API is used to analyze the class definitions and how the object manager and factory understands what kind of dependencies are required for the specific class. So guys, that is all I have for you today. I hope you like this video and you understand a bit more about Magento and how it works internally. If you have any questions, just write me or approach me personally. In the next video, I'm going to show you an example why it's really important to understand the whole dependency injection process and what kind of dangerous issues you might have if you misuse or misunderstand this concept. So guys, stay tuned and have a great day.